Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Michelle Rhee, and I'm the head of Patient Affairs and Advocacy at X4 Pharmaceuticals. Our mission is to develop treatments that have a clear and profound impact for patients with rare diseases, including primary immunodeficiencies like WHIM syndrome. So our goal today is to share some updates from a recent meeting of the European Society for Immunodeficiencies. Our team was able to share research as well as learn about new advances and important resources to hopefully help improve the lives of patients. Today, we'll focus on updates shared at the meeting that are relevant specifically to the WHIM syndrome patient community. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit questions at any time. The presentation was structured so that you can ask questions as we go along. And you just need to click the chat button at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. We have a moderator, another Michelle with 2 L's, who will be watching the chat, and she'll make sure that your questions get asked. We're also recording today's session, and that will be shared afterwards in case you need to step away. The recording will also be shared with anyone who wasn't able to join today. So we'll be adding captions as well for the recorded session, or recorded version. And in today's webinar, we'll talk briefly about what medical meetings are, and then dig into the specific areas that were covered at ESID and that are relevant to the WHIM syndrome patient community. And I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Sarah Cohen, a trained pediatric hematologist oncologist and an expert in the treatment and care of people with WHIM syndrome. She's the Senior Medical Director of Rare Diseases at X4 Pharmaceuticals and an incredibly passionate advocate for those with WHIM syndrome. Thank you so much for presenting, Dr. Cohen.
Thank you, Michelle. So first of all, I want to say that I'm really honored to be here today. It's really a privilege to speak to the patients on the call today that I'm hoping to learn also from your questions. I've had the chance to work with patients with WHIM syndrome since 2007 and work closely with basic research and clinical research projects since then. So thank you for attending. So I think we wanted to start really by focusing on why medical meetings matter. So medical meetings are important because they're one of the main ways for the medical research community to share updates. And I will say something about the ESID conference. To me, ESID, which is the European Society for Immunodeficiency, and which happens in various countries, European countries, used to be every other year, then was every year, now it's gone back to every other year. It's an extremely important dynamic conference, and it's a little bit like a family for patients, for physicians who care for patients with primary immune deficiency. And there's also a patient counterpart. So these are presentations and posters that researchers use to share the details of their findings, either looking at individual case reports or larger studies, and there's both clinical data that's presented as well as basic research science. So in order to learn more about primary immune deficiency and their impact on patients and how we can best manage complex diseases, it's important to bring experts together to share these insights on research and clinical experiences and to learn as fast as we can on what has worked and some of the challenges. So when researchers collaborate and clinicians collaborate, it leads to further studies designed to find safe and effective potential treatments. And it's definitely a lot of also of networking that occurs around these meetings, either at the big congresses, but also in smaller subcommittees during the year. And doctors are able to share their experiences caring for patients and to really teach. If you are a physician who cares for a number of patients within a certain disease space, it's really the opportunity to teach physicians who may have only one patient and also be able to connect as to who the disease experts are in these different rare conditions. So patients also benefit from this collaboration, especially when it comes to difficult to manage symptoms. And I've definitely personally learned a lot from my colleagues in these conferences. So we can go to the next slide. So speaking specifically about WHIM syndrome, as you may know in the history of WHIM syndrome, so WHIM was first reported in a young 10-year-old girl in 1964 independently by two different physicians who published their findings in the New England Journal of Medicine. And then subsequently, there were some individual case reports published in the literature. And in 1990, Swelzer's team kind of colleged all of that together and coined for the first time the acronym WHIM, which stands for four of the key manifestations of the disease: warts, hypogammaglobulinemia, infections, and myelokathexis. And it's kind of interesting looking at that acronym today. I don't think we can change it, or we're no longer trying to change it. But in many ways, it actually can be misleading because it doesn't capture the full extent of the disease. And so physicians who don't know WHIM syndrome often expect that patients will present that full spectrum. And the reality is quite different, as we'll talk about on this slide and on some of the subsequent slides. So first of all, we've discovered that there are other important aspects of the disease that are not represented in the four letters of the acronym. And for the first time at the ESID conference this year, there was a report of autoimmune or autoinflammatory complications in patients with WHIM syndrome. So up to now, this had not been reported in the published literature. And I would say that there were some sporadic reports from physicians who told us my patient has psoriasis or diabetes type 1, but this hasn't really been pulled together. And in this cohort of 61 patients, they found that a number of patients had autoimmune or autoinflammatory complications. And so the key finding is that signs of autoimmunity or autoinflammation should also prompt testing for primary immune deficiency. And when associated with neutropenia, this could actually be a sign of WHIM syndrome. And that's very novel, and as healthcare providers, we can now say that this is like a new aspect of the disease that has been under-recognized up until now. We can go to the next slide, please. So at the ESID conference this year, researchers presented data and insights from new studies, as well as a review of patient information to really gain an overall understanding of WHIM and primary immune deficiency. In particular, they looked at patient charts that had not, of patients that were diagnosed with WHIM syndrome and that had not been reported in any body of literature up until today. And they found, and what's not surprising for people who know the disease well, but it's really important to show that data out there, that children in particular may not have full manifestations of the disease. For example, children may not have warts. And this can be very misleading for clinicians. So while it may seem evident to patients, and I'm curious to know, because of the acronym WHIM, a lot of physicians may look at, oh, well, this patient doesn't have warts, so may eliminate WHIM syndrome. So being able to really say to clinicians that children with WHIM syndrome may not have warts and that these may develop later on in life or not develop at all is very important communication. They also showed that when you're thinking of children with WHIM syndrome, children are more likely to have manifestations of the disease in terms of infections and neutropenia. And so to avoid a delay in diagnosis and treatment, we really need to think about these types of manifestations of the disease, respiratory infections associated with chronic ongoing neutropenia that should be a prompt to do genetic testing for patients with WHIM syndrome, even if they don't have all the manifestations of the disease that are classically thought to be associated with WHIM, for example, even if they don't have warts. We can go to the next slide. So they looked at 61 patients from around the world, and out of these 61 patients, 20% of these were diagnosed based on a positive family history, which means that they were, for example, children or related to another patient that had a known diagnosis of WHIM syndrome. 18% of these patients presented with autoimmune and autoinflammatory complications. Now, I would say that I think that there was also like a bias in recruitment. We were specifically interested in these autoimmune complications, and so we did reach out, particularly kind of looking for those. So it's really hard to say at this point what's the real prevalence of those complications, but at least we know that they are out there. And that they are part of the presentation, at least of a number of patients with WHIM syndrome. We also found that 20% of patients suffered with end organ damage, which means when the disease affects different organs in the body, resulting in complications such as bronchiectasis in the lungs or hearing loss due to repeated otitis media, for example. So the key finding here is that sharing information globally helps identify trends. Patients that are diagnosed by family history do better because they are diagnosed earlier. And I would go one step further, is the goal is really to increase awareness around rare diseases, including WHIM syndrome, so that we can make the diagnosis earlier and initiate appropriate treatments to avoid end organ damage in these patients, which is in many cases not reversible. We can go to the next slide. So when we look at patients in the context of the global pandemic that we're all experiencing, there are many challenges for the general population, but even more so for people living with primary immune deficiencies. So I think we were all really interested in seeing kind of what the results in the conference were in these presentations, and I think we will continue to learn more. But I would say that thankfully, the reports were relatively encouraging, showing that people with primary immune deficiency did not have a more severe COVID-19 symptomatology than the general population. Obviously, you can't look at this on an individual basis. This is really looking across larger number of patients and using really the methodology of reaching out to physicians who specifically care for these types of patients in like a questionnaire form. So the other key finding is that it seems like being immunocompromised in itself is not a major factor for severe COVID-19 in the patient studied, but there are a lot of confounding factors. And one of them is that these patients may have very severe complications that are not related to the SARS-CoV-2 infection, but rather to their underlying disease. For example, they gave a case of patients that have what are called opportunistic infections in patients with a type of severe combined immunodeficiency or severe graft versus host disease post-transplant. So they may have actually more complications of the disease and not even have time to have the severe manifestations of COVID. So I think we still need to be really careful. But overall, I think it was very reassuring that in the current observations that we have, we did not find that people with primary immune deficiency have more severe COVID-19 related symptoms. And I say this with caution. Now, we've looked at patients with WHIM, pediatric patients, and COVID-19. Let's focus our attention on adult patients with primary immune deficiency. So there were presentations looking at adults, and these pose unique challenges. On the one hand, primary immune deficiency is often even harder to diagnose in adults because there are so many variable manifestations of the disease with different symptoms. So healthcare providers have to learn to recognize these many complex signs that should lead to genetic testing, and this really goes with increasing awareness, and not only among like the ESID physicians who attend the conference, but really much more broadly. Adults with primary immune deficiency are more likely to experience organ damage. And so the manifestations can be more severe, and I think this also has to do with a delay in diagnosis. Finally, they did talk about the importance of transplants, that when end organ damage affects a particular organ, for example, you can see patients with the appearance of liver insufficiency, then any possibility of transplant of that organ should occur as soon as possible, while the general well-being of the patient and allows this. So we can go to the next slide. I hope I'm not speaking too fast, Michelle. So there was a key, sorry.
You're perfect.
Okay. So there's a key it's very hard, you have to know, speaking to an audience that I don't see. So anyways, bear with me. So there's a key presentation really covered the importance of understanding how we measure quality of life. So quality of life measurements try to understand the impact a disease or a condition has on a patient's daily life. So everything from their sleep and physical abilities and well-being to their social life and emotional state. So primary immune deficiency can present with many challenges, especially for patients who have had stem cell transplants. They may be cured from their disease, but may have lifelong, sometimes symptoms or complications due to the treatment that they have received. And so there are a number of studies really evaluating the long-term quality of life and challenges that these patients may experience. I can give one example of, for example, teenage girls that we followed after transplant, and we may need to very carefully monitor with the endocrinologist signs of whether or not they are able to, I would say, naturally reach puberty, or whether there needs to be some intervention. And so it is like an ongoing, lifelong monitoring that has to occur. So the way quality of life is measured may not address specific concerns to primary immune deficiency. And so sometimes, and I would say most of the time, our tools are very limited, and we don't feel like we're capturing the full experience of the patients. And so new tools are in development to try to address that. And this tells us that we need to do more to understand the daily burdens of primary immune deficiency and how we measure them. Great. Michelle, I'm not sure if you said that you would present this or if you want me to present this. Happy to do both.
If you want, you can.
Okay, great. So when we look ahead, what are the upcoming future medical meetings? So these future medical meetings will continue to provide researchers and healthcare providers opportunities to collaborate, to discuss what are the best management for patients with complex situations, to share knowledge and scientific advances. These are some of the upcoming medical meetings that you can see that we'll be participating in, and we invite you to visit our website for any information and updates shared at these meetings. So you can see, for example, the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology, the Clinical Immunology Society, the European Hematology Association. And I believe that a number of these meetings may be entirely virtual due to the current context of the pandemic. You can go to the next slide. So finally, let's talk about tools and registries for primary immune deficiency patients. So experts shared very helpful information about patient tools for people living with primary immune deficiencies, including WHIM syndrome and primary immune deficiency registries around the world. So I will say, for a disclosure, that I think that these are really the fundamental tools by which we learn. Individual case reports of patients are very important, but the more data we can generate in like an aggregate manner in the context of registries really gives us a full and very solid picture and information. It's also a way for patients to advocate for the medical needs that they have. So registries are really important ways for experts to gather useful insights on patient care. Many countries have national registries, including Sweden, Germany, France, Bulgaria, Greece, UK, Slovenia, or Paraguay. Russia, Belarus, and South Korea also have their own patient registries. And so they're only as good as, I guess, the outreach that they are able to perform. So in Italy, there's a primary immunodeficiency network. It includes over 3,000 patients from 60 centers throughout the country. Similar organization in France. So they're collecting key insights. So let's talk about the Italian one, including finding a younger age of diagnosis in males, and they found antibody deficiencies in 63% of cases, which is what we see in most of these registries as being the most prevalent type of immune deficiency. So the ERN, or European Reference Network, is a rare immunodeficiency autoinflammatory and autoimmune disease network, or RITA. It connects experts around the world to help advance research, help patients. And you can see, and I believe that you'll be getting the slides after this meeting if you want to look at their websites. We talked about the ESID registry. So this is an important registry, really informing physicians about the numbers of immunodeficiency patients in respective countries. And this is really the physicians entering their patient data into the ESID registry. The Immunodeficiency Foundation has programs that you can sign up for as a patient, and also a WHIM syndrome webinar that you can watch on their website. And we put the link here. And finally, we noted the International Patient Organization for Primary Immune Deficiency, or IPOPI, which shares information for patients on their website. And they have a lot of very interesting document that I invite you to look at about the state of care for patients with primary immune deficiency and WHIM syndrome on their website. It's also the National Neutropenia Network for patients who have severe neutropenia. It's another organization with great resources. And the ID, or PID, which is a new resource for patients living with primary immune deficiency. And this offers resources and informations on free genetic testing options, which can be really important, particularly for some countries or specific patients in different socioeconomical circumstances. And of course, there's the WHIM syndrome Facebook community that I think you're all aware of, and that I hear is a really great place to meet others and share resources. Michelle, I will pass this on to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cohen. That was fantastic. I love hearing you speak every time. I feel like I learned something new, and I appreciate so much your time. I know it's so valuable. And I thank all of you also for participating and attending. And I wanted to remind you as well that if you have any questions, you can click on the bottom in the chat function or the Q&A and ask any of your questions. The other Michelle with 2 L's will be moderating. We're also going to be sending out a follow-up email with some of these links, some of the resources. So if you aren't able to write these down or for any reason have any issues, you'll be able to get them afterwards.